A shoeshine boy leans toward a stockbroker's polished loafers and, between strokes, offers a hot tip on where the market is headed next. The broker takes the tip, then quietly sells everything he owns before lunch. That is the story Joseph Kennedy liked to tell about the autumn before the crash of 1929, and whether the boy was real or a flourish added later, the instinct behind it was not invented for the telling. The self-made rich are, above almost everything else, people who notice what a room is feeling before the room notices it about itself. This list gathers 100 small habits from people who built fortunes with their own hands across 3,000 years: a Roman landlord, a Malian king, a Dutch peddler who sold nothing but blue cloth, a woman who made her name testing face cream on the back of her own hand. None of them agreed on much. Some hoarded, some gave everything away in secret, some never once raised their voice. A few were kind and several were not. What they share is not a formula and never a shortcut. It is a set of small, repeated, almost boring behaviors that outlasted every fortune built on excitement alone. We are not here to tell you what to do with your money. We are here to watch, closely and calmly, what these particular people did with theirs, and let their habits speak for themselves. A 16-year-old bookkeeping clerk in Cleveland opens a slim red notebook and writes a single word at the top of the first page: ledger. Underneath it, in a careful, upright hand, he records 50 cents earned for a day's work, then a small sum given to his church, then a few cents lent to a friend who will, the entry notes, pay it back on Friday. The clerk is John D. Rockefeller, and the notebook he called Ledger A survived him by more than a century. He kept it and the habit it started for the rest of his life. Long after he had built and dismantled Standard Oil, long after he had become the richest man of his age by a wide margin, visitors to his study would still find him bent over columns of figures, checking a household expense against a total from memory, correcting an error of a few cents with the same seriousness he had once brought to correcting a whole ledger page as a boy. The habit was never really about the money in front of him. It was about knowing at any hour exactly where he stood. Biographers who have studied Rockefeller's early years point to this constant private accounting as the thing that separated him from richer, flashier competitors in the oil business, men who expanded fast and never quite knew their own numbers until a bad season forced them to look. Rockefeller always knew his numbers because he had never stopped writing them down. Even his charitable giving, which eventually reached enormous sums, was logged with the same discipline as the nickel he had once given his church as a boy, tracked, dated, and never boasted about in the moment. There is something almost anticlimactic about a fortune built this way. No single dramatic decision explains it. No one bold gamble that historians can point to and say, there, that was the turn. Just a boy with a notebook, and then a much older man with the same notebook's habit, still checking the arithmetic of his own life long after the arithmetic had stopped mattering to anyone but him. The ledger habit never made the news. It simply never stopped. Cornelius Vanderbilt signed contracts for railroad ice spanning hundreds of miles, and by most accounts he did it uneasily. In handwriting his own clerks sometimes struggled to read. He had left school at 11 to work the ferries around Staten Island, and whatever formal education might have given him, he built his fortune without it. What he had instead was an unusual trust in what he could see and hear directly. Vanderbilt preferred to walk his own docks rather than read a report about them, to talk face-to-face with a rival captain rather than exchange letters, to judge a deal by the tone of the man offering it rather than by the fine print underneath. Associates who worked closely with him often ended up managing his written correspondence, translating his instincts into the paperwork the business world expected, while Vanderbilt kept doing what he trusted most, watching the water and the men who worked it. This did not make him careless. If anything, his discomfort with paper made him more careful about who he dealt with in person, since a spoken promise from an unreliable man was, to him, worth checking twice before a single dollar changed hands. He was famous for testing a rival's nerve directly, undercutting a shipping line's prices until the rival either matched him or folded, a strategy that worked precisely because Vanderbilt was willing to watch and wait rather than negotiate from behind a desk. Historians studying the Commodore, as he came to be called, have noted that his limited comfort with written material may have sharpened rather than dulled his business sense. He could not lean on contracts to do the thinking for him, so he learned to read people instead, an education the classroom never offered but the docks, and later the railroads apparently did. By the time he died, Vanderbilt's fortune was reckoned among the largest in the country's history, built largely on decisions made in person, on wharves and in offices, by a man who trusted his own eyes over anyone else's paragraph. He never did learn to enjoy the paperwork, he simply stopped needing to. A caravan crosses into Cairo's outskirts, and word runs ahead of it faster than the camels themselves. The ruler of Mali is passing through on his way to Mecca, and he is giving away gold to anyone who asks. Mansa Musa, ruler of one of the wealthiest gold-producing empires in medieval West Africa, spent and gave so freely during his pilgrimage that Cairo's own chroniclers, writing years later, still described the disruption to the local gold market it had left behind. The habit was not careless generosity, so much as a very specific kind of statement. A ruler's wealth in Musa's world was measured partly by how visibly he could afford to give it away, and a pilgrimage through the great trading cities of the Islamic world was exactly the stage on which that habit mattered most. Musa gave gold to the poor, to scholars, to mosque builders, and reportedly bought so many goods in Cairo's markets that merchants raised their prices to meet the sudden demand, only to find, once he had moved on, that gold itself was now worth noticeably less in the city than it had been before he arrived. Accounts written afterward, including by the traveller and historian Ibn Battuta a generation later, describe a Cairo still adjusting to the aftershock. Some later scholars caution that the numbers repeated in popular retellings have grown with each telling the way any legend does when it survives centuries of retelling rather than careful accounting. What is not disputed is the underlying pattern. This was generosity at a scale large enough to move markets, not merely impress onlookers. It is a strange kind of habit to study, because unlike most items on this list, generosity here did real, measurable economic damage to the very city it was meant to honour. Musa's gold built his reputation as one of history's wealthiest rulers. It also, for a time, made every merchant in Cairo a little poorer in terms of what their own gold could buy. Cairo's markets eventually recovered. The story of the king who broke them never entirely faded. In the spring of 1519, 7 electors gathered to decide who would rule as Holy Roman Emperor, and the 2 leading candidates needed enormous sums of borrowed money to buy the votes that would decide it. Jakob Fugger, a merchant banker from Augsburg, whose family had grown rich on silver mines and woven cloth, provided the largest single loan behind the winning candidate, a young Habsburg prince who became Charles V. Fugger did not lend this money quietly or anonymously. He later wrote to the new emperor reminding him, in terms modern readers might find startlingly blunt, that without Fugger's money the crown would have gone to someone else entirely. It was not flattery. It was, by most historical accounts, simply true, and Fugger knew it. This habit of lending not to diversify risk across many small borrowers but to concentrate enormous trust and enormous money in a single relationship with the most powerful person available defined Fugger's career. He financed popes as readily as emperors, understanding that a debt owed by a ruler was different from a debt owed by a merchant, since a ruler who owed you money also, in practice, owed you access, favour and protection for your other business across his territories. The mines Fugger, controlled in the Tyrol and in Hungary, were themselves often secured through arrangements with rulers who needed his money and paid him back in mineral rights rather than coin. It was a strategy with obvious danger built into it. A single defaulting prince could have ruined the family in a way that no ordinary merchant's failure could. But Fugger's read of power turned out to be extraordinarily reliable across decades of lending, and by the time he died, his personal fortune was estimated by later historians as among the largest, relative to the economy of his era, that Europe had ever produced. He built no ships, mined no ore himself, wove no cloth with his own hands. What Fugger built, patiently and at enormous personal exposure, was trust with the handful of people who could make or unmake an empire, and then he collected on it. The emperor he helped crown ruled for decades. The debt was never forgotten by either man. A woman in a plain, aging black dress haggles over the price of oatmeal at a New York grocer's counter, and the grocer, who does not recognize her, assumes she cannot afford better. She is at that moment one of the richest women in the United States. Hetty Green inherited a considerable whaling and shipping fortune from her family in the 19th century and multiplied it many times over through careful lending and real estate, eventually earning newspapers nickname the Witch of Wall Street, a label she resented but never quite shed. What made her famous beyond her wealth was the way she lived with it. She wore the same black dress until it wore through, moved between modest boarding houses rather than owning a grand residence, and reportedly delayed medical treatment for her son's injured leg, while searching for a free clinic, a decision biographers have treated as the darkest edge of a frugality that, in smaller doses, looked merely eccentric. Green kept her financial records personally and trusted almost no one else with them, carrying documents in worn bags rather than leaving them with banks she did not fully trust. She lent money at interest to cities, railroads, and individuals, often at terms more generous than her reputation for stinginess would suggest, provided she believed the borrower would repay reliably. Contemporaries who studied her habits noted the contradiction directly. A woman who would not spend a few cents on herself was, at the same time, willing to lend enormous sums to institutions she judged creditworthy. Historians studying Green's life have generally resisted flattening her into either a simple miser or a woman ahead of her time in her business instincts. She was, more precisely, someone for whom spending and having had become entirely separate categories, in a way that let one grow enormous while the other stayed, deliberately, or she died with a fortune newspapers struggled to estimate accurately. She died, by most accounts, in the same plain dress she had worn for years. A man pulls his dusty red pickup truck into a parking lot outside one of his own stores, and the employees inside, most of whom have never met him in person, would not necessarily guess that the man climbing out owns the company. Sam Walton built Walmart from a single discount store in Arkansas into the largest retailer in the country. And by most accounts he never adjusted his personal habits to match the scale of what he had built. He kept driving the same modest truck for years, wore plain work clothes on store visits, and was known for flying commercial rather than chartering private planes, long after either would have been an unremarkable expense for a man of his wealth. Walton framed this habit, in interviews and in his own writing, as a deliberate part of running the company rather than an accident of personal taste. He believed that a leader who lived visibly close to the way his employees lived earned a kind of trust that no amount of salary or speech-making could buy on its own. Store visits where he showed up unannounced, in ordinary clothes, driving an ordinary truck, became part of company legend precisely because they reinforced a message he wanted understood at every level of the business. Frugality was not a hardship imposed on employees while executives lived differently. It was the way the man at the top actually lived too. Whether the habit was entirely genuine or partly performance is a question biographers have debated without fully resolving, since a man that wealthy choosing to look modest is, itself, a kind of choice available only to the very rich. What is not in dispute is how consistently he kept it up, year after year, long past the point where anyone would have questioned a more comfortable life. The truck eventually wore out. The habit, by most accounts, never did. A man in economy class fills out a customs form with a cheap ballpoint pen, unremarkable among the passengers around him, and later that year Forbes magazine will list him among the wealthiest people alive. Ingvar K.H. Prad founded IKEA in Sweden and built it into a global furniture retailer on a simple, repeated principle that cost mattered more than comfort at every level of the business, including his own. He was known to fly economy on long trips, drive an aging Volvo for years past when most executives of his standing would have replaced it, and furnish his own home with products from his company's catalogue rather than anything grander. Employees who travelled with him described a man who reused paper, questioned unnecessary expenses in meetings personally, and treated a saved cent with the same seriousness he applied to a major business decision. K.H. Prad wrote openly about wanting this habit to be more than personal eccentricity. He described waste as a kind of moral failing within his company's culture, and insisted that IKEA's low prices depended on everyone inside the business, himself included, refusing small comforts that would eventually show up as higher costs to customers. Whether every detail of the frugality stories that circulated about him was entirely accurate, or occasionally polished for effect, is something biographers have questioned, since a founder's legend tends to grow neater with each retelling. What is well documented is the underlying consistency. K.H. Prad lived, by most independent accounts, with genuinely modest personal habits for decades after IKEA had made him one of the richest men in Europe, at a time when almost nothing about his daily choices required it. The habit outlived the need for it by a wide margin. He kept flying economy long after private jets would have cost him, relative to his fortune, almost nothing. A modest grey house on a quiet Omaha street looks, from the sidewalk, like any other house built in the middle of the 20th century, and for more than 60 years it has belonged to the same man, who is now among the wealthiest people alive. Warren Buffett bought the house in 1958 for a sum that, adjusted for the decades since, would barely register as a rounding error against his current fortune. He never moved, never built a larger estate, and has spoken often about not wanting the noise, literal or otherwise, that a grander residence would bring into his life. Colleagues who have worked alongside him for decades describe a daily routine that changed remarkably little across that time. The same drive to the same office, the same diet of simple, familiar foods, the same habit of reading for hours before most of his staff had arrived. Buffett has framed this consistency as directly connected to how he makes decisions about money, arguing in his own writing and interviews that a settled, undramatic personal life leaves more attention available for thinking clearly about business rather than managing the demands of an increasingly complicated lifestyle. He has often contrasted his own habits with executives who, in his telling, spend so much energy maintaining the trappings of wealth that they have little left over for the harder work of understanding what they actually own. Buffett's stability is itself a kind of privilege, available only because his wealth removed every practical reason to ever move, but the choice not to move, when so many people in his position eventually do, still says something about his particular temperament, a preference for the familiar and unremarkable over the impressive, sustained across a period long enough that it stopped looking like restraint and started looking simply like how the man lived. The house is still there, so, mostly unchanged, is the man inside. Ask Warren Buffett's staff what he is doing on an ordinary Tuesday, and the honest answer for most of the last 70 years has usually been the same: reading. Buffett has described spending a large majority of his working hours with reports, filings and newspapers spread across his desk, a habit he traces back to childhood trips to the library in Omaha. His longtime business partner Charlie Munger shared the habit almost exactly, and was known to say that he had never met a wise person who did not read constantly, a line repeated so often by admirers that it has become something close to their shared motto. Colleagues who worked closely with both men over the decades describe a partnership built less on dramatic meetings than on two men separately, absorbing enormous amounts of written material and then comparing conclusions, sometimes across a single phone call that lasted only minutes. The habit is notable partly because it contradicts the popular image of successful investing as a matter of hot tips, fast reflexes and split-second nerve. Buffett and Munger's version looked, from the outside, almost aggressively boring, hours spent alone with annual reports and biographies rather than trading floors or television appearances. Buffett has argued directly that this quiet accumulation of knowledge, repeated daily without much variation, mattered more to his results over a lifetime than any single decision he made under pressure. It is a habit that offers no shortcut for anyone hoping to copy it, since its entire value comes from decades of repetition rather than any one insight gained in an afternoon. Buffett himself has been blunt about this, describing the compounding of knowledge as similar in principle to the compounding of money, slow, largely invisible day to day, and only obvious in hindsight after enough years have passed. The reading never stopped being the main event. Everything else, by his own account, was built on top of it. Conrad Hilton arrived in Cisco, Texas, in 1919 intending to buy a small bank, and when the deal fell through at the last moment, he did not go home. Across the street stood a cramped, overcrowded hotel doing brisk business from oil workers who had nowhere else to sleep, and Hilton, with the money he had brought for the bank, bought the hotel instead. It was not the plan he had arrived with, and by his own later account, he knew almost nothing about running a hotel at the time. What he did understand quickly was occupancy. The simple arithmetic of how many beds were filled each night against how many existed, and he began adjusting the property accordingly, converting unused lobby space into more rentable rooms and squeezing extra revenue out of a building that had never been designed with real efficiency in mind. That first hotel became the seed of what eventually grew into one of the largest hotel chains in the world, but the habit worth noticing is not the size of what it became. It is how quickly Hilton abandoned a stalled plan for a workable one sitting directly in front of him, rather than waiting for the original opportunity to somehow reappear. He repeated the pattern across his career, buying distressed properties during downturns Other investors treated as reasons to wait, including several hotels purchased for a fraction of their prior value during the difficult years of the Great Depression, when many competitors assumed the entire industry was finished. Hilton wrote later that he had learned early not to mourn a plan that had died, since mourning it changed nothing about the money already in his pocket or the opportunity standing across the street. The bank he never bought in Cisco has long since been forgotten by almost everyone except his biographers. The hotel across the street from it became a company that outlived them both. Sarah Breedlove, who later took the name Madam C.J. Walker, began her business selling homemade hair treatments door to door, demonstrating the product on her own scalp for skeptical customers who had no reason yet to trust a bottle from a stranger. She built her early sales this way for years, traveling by train through towns across the American South, staying in whatever lodging was available to a black businesswoman in the early 20th century, and personally showing women how to use the product rather than simply describing it. As the business grew, Walker trained an expanding network of sales agents, insisting that they learn to demonstrate the treatments in person the same way she had, rather than simply handing over a jar and a price. This habit of direct, hands-on demonstration, rather than distant advertising, ran through the entire company. Walker held conventions for her agents where she taught technique alongside business practice, treating salesmanship as a skill that had to be shown, not merely explained in a pamphlet. She travelled constantly herself well after the company had grown large enough that she could have delegated the work entirely, continuing to visit new markets in person to see firsthand how the products were being received and adjusted. By the time of her death, Walker had built one of the largest fortunes ever accumulated at that point by a self-made American woman, and biographers who have studied her rise consistently point to this habit of relentless, personal, face-to-face selling as the foundation the rest of the business was built on. She trusted very little about her growth to advertising alone in an era when many competitors relied on it, preferring instead the slower, more exhausting method of convincing one customer and later one agent at a time. The company outgrew the door-to-door selling that built it. Walker herself never entirely stopped doing it anyway. Milton Hershey did not simply build a chocolate factory in rural Pennsylvania. He built streets around it, then houses along the streets, then a school, a park, a trolley line, connecting the town to nearby cities, and eventually a whole community that took his own name. Hershey had failed at several earlier candy businesses before finally succeeding with caramel and then chocolate, and by the time his chocolate company was thriving, he approached the surrounding town with a habit that surprised many of his contemporaries in industry. Rather than treating his workforce's housing and daily life as someone else's problem, he built comfortable homes for employees, funded public amenities well beyond what factory towns typically offered, and later established a school for orphan children, funded initially and substantially by his own personal wealth, that continues operating today. His reasoning, described in his own writing and interviews from the period, was straightforward rather than sentimental. A stable, well-cared-for community around a factory, he argued, produced a more reliable and loyal workforce than a transient one, housed in whatever cheap lodging happened to be nearby. He treated the town's infrastructure as an investment in the business's long-term health, rather than a charitable afterthought, though the school for orphans, established without children of his own, eventually became the primary recipient of his fortune after his death, structured so that ownership of the company itself would fund the school indefinitely. This habit of building far beyond the minimum required for a functioning factory, extending outward into schools, parks, and permanent institutions, set Hershey apart from many industrialists of his era who built factories and left the surrounding towns to fend for themselves. It also meant that when Hershey died, his fortune did not simply pass to heirs, since he had none, but continued funding the town and the school he had built for as long as the company he founded kept operating. The chocolate factory still runs. The town built around it still bears his name. For years, journalists covering wealthy philanthropists had no idea that one of the largest anonymous donors funding universities, hospitals, and public health programs around the world was a man who lived, by most accounts, without a permanent home of his own and flew coach on long international trips. Chuck Feeney co-founded Duty Free Shoppers, a retail chain built around airport shopping that grew into an enormous business, and rather than accumulating a fortune to match it, he began, systematically, giving nearly all of it away through a foundation called the Atlantic Philanthropies. Structured for years so that recipients often did not know the source of the money they had received. Feeney insisted on this anonymity as a deliberate condition of the giving itself, reasoning that public recognition would complicate both his own life and the decisions of the institutions receiving his money. He described his approach as giving while living, a phrase that became closely associated with him once his role finally became public, built on the belief that money did more good delivered while the giver could still watch and adjust its use than left to accumulate until after death. Over roughly 4 decades, Feeney's foundation gave away more than $6 billion, funding causes across public health, education, and human rights in dozens of countries. And by the time the foundation formally closed after distributing essentially its entire endowment, Feeney himself had deliberately reduced his own remaining wealth to a modest sum. His habit influenced other prominent wealthy individuals directly. Several who later signed public pledges to give away the majority of their fortunes credited conversations with Feeney as part of what shaped their thinking, even though Feeney himself had spent decades actively avoiding the kind of publicity that giving typically attracts. He gave away nearly everything he built and asked for as long as he reasonably could, that almost no one notice. By the time people did notice, there was very little fortune left to talk about. As a boy working in a Pittsburgh cotton mill, Andrew Carnegie relied on a local colonel's small personal library, open to working boys on Saturdays, to read the books his family could not afford to buy. He later said the memory of that borrowed access never left him. Once Carnegie had built an enormous fortune in the steel industry, he turned to funding public libraries with a consistency that became one of the defining habits of his later life. Rather than simply writing checks to towns that asked, Carnegie developed a specific formula, offering to fund a library building if the local community agreed to provide the land and commit ongoing funds to keep it running, a structure meant to ensure that towns treated the library as their own responsibility rather than a passive gift. Over several decades, this formula funded more than 2,500 libraries across the United States, Britain, and several other English-speaking countries. Carnegie wrote extensively about his reasoning in an essay often called The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that a fortune held onto until death and passed to heirs did less good for the world than the same fortune actively redistributed by its builder while he could still direct where it went. Libraries specifically appealed to him because they matched his own path, self-directed learning available to anyone willing to walk through the door, rather than aid that required no effort from the recipient. The habit was not without its critics then or since. Some contemporaries argued that funding libraries allowed Carnegie to avoid harder questions about wages and working conditions in his own steel mills, where labour disputes had at times turned violent. The libraries themselves, though, still stand in many of the towns that received them, functioning more than a century later much as Carnegie intended, open to anyone willing to walk in and read. The mill boy who once needed a colonel's permission eventually made that permission unnecessary for millions of others. Visitors to Florence in the middle of the 15th century would have struggled to name the city's actual ruler by looking at its official offices, since the man who effectively controlled Florentine politics for decades, Khz Medici, held no formal government title at all. Cosimo had inherited and expanded a banking fortune built partly on loans to popes and princes across Europe, and he used that financial leverage to place allies in Florence's elected councils, fund public projects that built his popularity among ordinary citizens, and quietly undermine rivals who threatened his family's position, all without ever needing the visible authority of a crown or a formal seat of power. He preferred, according to contemporaries and later historians studying Florentine records, to work through intermediaries and behind-the-scenes influence rather than through direct, attributable command. This habit of avoiding visible titles served a specific purpose beyond modesty. Florence's political culture was deeply suspicious of any single family accumulating too much open power, having exiled or executed ambitious citizens before, and Cosimo appears to have understood that formal titles would have made him a target in a way that quiet financial influence did not. His banking network gave him the ability to make or break the fortunes of rivals through simple decisions about credit, a form of leverage that operated with none of the visible drama of a political appointment. Cosimo was, by most historical accounts, genuinely careful and even self-effacing in public settings, funding churches, libraries and artists under his family's name, while consistently declining honours that would have made his authority more official. His son and later his grandson Lorenzo inherited both the fortune and the underlying habit, ruling Florence in practice for generations, while the city's formal republican institutions remained technically intact on paper. Florence never crowned a Medici during Cosimo's lifetime. It never really needed to. Rome in the late Republic had no organised public fire department, and fires in its densely packed wooden and mud brick neighbourhoods spread quickly and often catastrophically. Marcus Cineas Crassus, a Roman general and politician who became one of the wealthiest men of his era, is said by the historian Plutarch to have turned this gap directly into a business. According to the account, Crassus maintained a trained team of enslaved workers skilled in construction and firefighting, and when a fire broke out he would arrive at the scene and offer to buy the burning property, along with neighbouring buildings likely to catch fire next, at a steeply reduced price. Only once the sale was agreed would his team begin working to put the fire out and salvage what remained. Owners facing the total loss of their property often accepted whatever price was offered, rather than watch everything burn for nothing. Historians studying the period note that Plutarch, writing more than a century after Crassus' death, may have shaped the anecdote for dramatic or moral effect, a caution worth applying to several vivid stories from ancient biography. Even allowing for that uncertainty, the underlying pattern fits comfortably with what is independently known about Crassus, who was widely regarded by contemporaries as ruthlessly opportunistic in real estate, acquiring properties across Rome through methods that made him deeply unpopular even as they made him extraordinarily rich. Crassus went on to finance a significant portion of his own political career from this property wealth, eventually forming a powerful alliance with Julius Caesar and Pompey that reshaped Roman politics. His fortune, by the estimates later Roman writers offered, rivaled the entire treasury of the Roman state at points during his life. Rome eventually built public fire response of its own, decades after Crassus was gone. The gap he exploited did not stay open forever, but it stayed open long enough. A dry goods merchant in San Francisco during the years after the gold rush noticed that miners kept tearing through their trousers within weeks of buying them, and rather than expand into dozens of new product lines to chase every opportunity the growing city offered, Levi Strauss narrowed his focus towards solving that one specific repeated complaint. Working with a tailor named Jacob Davis, who had developed the idea of reinforced pants with metal rivets at points of stress, Strauss secured a patent on the design and began manufacturing denim work, pants built specifically to survive the abuse of mining and manual labour. The company's product line stayed remarkably narrow for decades afterward, focused almost entirely on durable work clothing rather than diversifying into the wider dry goods trade that had originally supported the business. This habit of narrowness ran against the instincts of many contemporaries in retail, who expanded aggressively into whatever categories a growing city seemed to demand. Strauss instead kept refining a single durable product, adjusting stitching, fabric weight, and rivet placement based on direct feedback from workers who wore the pants daily in mines, on railroads, and on ranches across the American West. The company's identity became inseparable from that narrow focus long after the gold rush itself had ended, and the original customer base had shifted into other kinds of manual labor. Strauss died a comfortably wealthy man by the standards of his era, and the company he built continued operating on essentially the same narrow principle for generations after his death, expanding the range of denim products slowly rather than diluting the core idea. Historians studying the company's growth have pointed to this discipline, staying narrowly focused on one durable product rather than diversifying too quickly, as unusually consistent for a retail business of that period. The dry goods business around it eventually faded. The one product built to survive hard use did not. Inside Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park, workers tested filament after filament for a workable electric light, carbonized cotton thread, platinum wire, various plant fibers, each one glowing briefly and then failing, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within hours, before finally being discarded in favor of the next candidate. Thomas Edison ran this testing process with a discipline that later became central to how his laboratory operated on every project it took on. Rather than waiting for a single flash of insight to solve the electric light problem, he organized systematic, repeated experimentation across an enormous number of materials, a method that by some accounts eventually numbered well over 1,000 distinct attempts before his team settled on a carbonized filament that could burn reliably for many hours. Edison was famously blunt about how he understood these failures. He is widely quoted as saying he had not failed, but had instead found many ways that did not work, a formulation that reframed each dead end as useful information rather than wasted effort. Whether every version of that quote circulating today matches his exact original words is difficult to confirm with certainty, but the underlying habit it describes is well documented across his laboratory's own records, which show relentless, itemized tracking of what had been tried and discarded. This approach extended beyond the light bulb into nearly everything Edison's laboratory worked on, from the phonograph to early motion picture equipment, and it required a workforce willing to tolerate long stretches without visible progress, something Edison managed by treating the laboratory itself as a continuous, ongoing experiment rather than a series of discrete projects with fixed deadlines. The finished light bulb eventually reached homes and streets around the world. The 1,000 or more discarded filaments that came before it are remembered only in laboratory notebooks nobody outside his team ever read. Long before Estée Lauder's name appeared on department store counters around the world, she was mixing face creams in her uncle's small laboratory and testing the results on her own skin and on the faces of friends and family, adjusting formulas based on how they actually felt and worked rather than trusting theory alone. Lauder began selling these creams directly in beauty salons, demonstrating the product on customers' hands and faces in person rather than simply describing its effects on a label. This habit of hands-on demonstration became central to how she built her company, insisting that sales staff learn to apply the product to a customer directly, offering a small free sample and a personal touch that distinguished her counters from competitors who relied more heavily on advertising alone. She maintained close, personal involvement in product development for decades, even as the company grew large enough that she could easily have delegated it entirely. Colleagues who worked with her described a woman who insisted on testing new formulas herself before approving them for sale, treating her own skin as the company's actual first line of quality control. This was not simply caution. It reflected a broader belief she held that a cosmetics company's credibility depended on the founder genuinely believing in and using her own products, rather than merely marketing something she had not personally verified. By the time Estée Lauder companies had grown into a global business, the habit of personal testing and direct demonstration had become embedded in how the company trained its staff at every counter, a legacy of a founder who had once mixed the cream herself and needed her own face to prove that it worked. She built a company that outlived her personal testing routine by decades. The insistence on trying it yourself first never quite left the culture she built. Ray Kroc walked into franchised McDonald's restaurants unannounced, and by most accounts he would sometimes pull a ruler from his pocket to check the length of the French fries being served, or inspect a restaurant's parking lot for stray litter before he had even gone inside to check the kitchen. Kroc had spent years as a traveling salesman before becoming involved with the McDonald brothers' original restaurant, and once he took control of expanding the concept into a franchise, he applied a habit of obsessive attention to small, repeatable details across every location bearing the company's name. He insisted that every restaurant follow exact specifications for cooking times, portion sizes, and cleanliness, reasoning that a customer in one city needed to have the same experience as a customer in another, or the brand's entire value would collapse into inconsistency. This habit extended into how franchisees were selected and trained. Kroc preferred owner-operators willing to work inside their own restaurants daily rather than absentee investors, and he built an entire training program, eventually formalized into what the company called Hamburger University, specifically to instill this same obsession with consistency into every new franchisee before they were allowed to open a location. Kroc's personal visits to restaurants, often unannounced, and sometimes confrontational when standards slipped, became legendary within the company, as a demonstration that the standards were not merely written policy, but something the founder himself was willing to personally enforce. Biographers studying Croc's management style have generally agreed that this obsessive consistency, more than any single recipe or advertising campaign, was what allowed McDonald's to scale into thousands of locations without the quality collapsing the way many franchise concepts before it had. Croc treated sameness itself as the product being sold, as valuable to customers as the food. He kept inspecting parking lots personally long after the company had grown far too large for any one man to check them all. Walt Disney travelled to New York in 1928, expecting to renegotiate better terms for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a cartoon character he had created and which had already found real popularity with audiences. Instead, he learned that his distributor had secured the rights to the character and had quietly hired away several of his own animators to keep producing Oswald cartoons without him. Disney returned to California having lost both his character and much of his animation staff in a single trip. Rather than spending significant time contesting the loss through further negotiation, he and his remaining close collaborator, Iwerks, quickly began developing a new character, a mouse with large round ears, who debuted within months as Mickey Mouse. The speed of the turnaround, going from losing his signature character to introducing a replacement within roughly the same year, became part of the company's founding legend. Disney later described the loss of Oswald as one of the most painful moments of his early career, but colleagues who worked with him at the time consistently described his response as focused on rebuilding immediately rather than dwelling on what had happened. This habit of treating a serious professional setback as a problem to be solved quickly rather than an injury to recover from slowly appears repeatedly across Disney's career, including after several later films and business ventures that failed commercially or came close to bankrupting the studio entirely. Mickey Mouse's early cartoons struggled to find a distributor at first, ironically for some of the same reasons Oswald had been vulnerable, and Disney's insistence on adding synchronized sound to a later short helped the character finally break through commercially. The studio built on that breakthrough grew, within a decade, into one of the most significant entertainment companies in the world. Disney never regained the rights to Oswald during most of his lifetime. The mouse he built instead became far more famous than the rabbit he lost. Gabrielle Chanel spent several years of her childhood in an orphanage run by Catholic nuns after her mother's death, where the sisters taught the girls sewing as a practical, marketable skill for their eventual futures outside the convent walls. Chanel later built her earliest business making hats, learning millinery from an aunt, before expanding into clothing designs that deliberately broke from the elaborate, restrictive fashion popular among wealthy women at the time. She drew directly on the plain, functional sewing she had learned as a girl, favouring simple lines and comfortable fabrics over the corsets and heavy ornamentation that had dominated women's clothing for decades. This habit of favouring function over excess, rooted in necessity rather than luxury, became the signature of everything she designed afterward, including the collarless jacket and the simple black dress that carried her name into households that never bought a single one of her actual garments. Chanel was notably guarded about the details of her early life for much of her adult career, allowing rumours and simplified stories to circulate rather than correcting them publicly, a habit biographers attribute partly to her discomfort with a background so different from the wealthy clientele she eventually served. Even so, she never fully hid the sewing skills' origin, crediting the discipline the convent had instilled in her as part of what let her run a large, demanding business with the same exacting attention she had once applied to a single seam. Her company grew into one of the most recognized fashion houses in the world, built on a design philosophy that traced back, more directly than most of her wealthy clients ever realized, to a convent workroom she had not chosen to enter. The orphanage sewing lessons were meant to prepare girls for modest futures. Chanel's future turned out considerably less modest than anyone teaching her had likely imagined. Li Ka-shing left school as a teenager after his father's death to support his family, working first in a plastics factory in Hong Kong before eventually starting his own small manufacturing company producing plastic flowers, a modest and unglamorous product compared to the vast real estate holdings that would later carry his name. He studied international trade magazines and industry catalogues to identify which plastic products were gaining popularity abroad, and noticing rising demand for artificial flowers in overseas markets, he shifted his young company's production toward them, eventually building enough capital from steady, unglamorous manufacturing profits to begin investing in Hong Kong real estate during the 1960s, a period when political uncertainty in the region had depressed property prices well below what many investors considered safe. This habit of patiently building capital in a low-status business before moving deliberately into a much larger one, rather than attempting to skip directly to the bigger opportunity, appears repeatedly across Li's early career. He did not treat the plastic flower business as beneath serious attention simply because it lacked prestige, applying the same close hands-on management to it that he later applied to far larger property and infrastructure holdings. Colleagues who studied his rise have noted that Li seemed to trust incremental, provable success in a small business more than a leap into a larger one, without first demonstrating the discipline at a smaller scale. By the time his company Chung Kong had grown into one of the largest conglomerates in Asia, spanning real estate, ports, telecommunications and retail, the plastic flower factory that had funded its earliest real estate purchases had long since faded into a footnote, remembered mostly by biographers rather than by the businesses Li's empire eventually became known for. The flowers themselves were never meant to lasted considerably longer. For years after Amash and Co. Ortega had become one of the wealthiest people in Europe, there was no publicly available photograph of him, a fact that journalists covering the retail industry found remarkable given the scale of the company he had built. Ortega started as a delivery boy for a shirt maker in Spain before eventually founding his own clothing company, which grew into Zara and later the larger Inditex group, known for rapidly translating runway fashion trends into affordable clothing sold within weeks, rather than the traditional fashion industry's much slower seasonal cycle. Throughout the company's growth, Ortega maintained an unusually low public profile, avoiding interviews and public appearances for decades, and colleagues described him eating in the same modest employee cafeteria as factory workers rather than a separate executive dining room. He was also known for dressing plainly, favouring the same simple sweater and casual clothes in public appearances he did eventually make later in life, a habit that stood in visible contrast to the fashion industry he had built his fortune within. Business writers who studied Inditex culture noted that Ortega's personal habits seemed to reflect a broader company philosophy that valued operational discipline over public image, focusing resources on logistics and design speed, rather than the kind of visible executive luxury common among competitors in the fashion retail industry. Ortega eventually stepped back from day-to-day management of the company, handing control to his daughter while remaining Inditex's largest shareholder. His personal wealth, built almost entirely from a business most competitors considered too fast-moving and unglamorous to dominate at the scale he eventually achieved, made him for periods the wealthiest person in Europe, a fact that remained oddly invisible to much of the public for years, simply because he had never sought the attention that often accompanies such wealth. The company became famous around the world. Its founder, by deliberate habit, stayed almost entirely unknown. A courier crosses the English Channel ahead of the official government dispatch carrying news of the outcome at Waterloo, and by the time London's markets have fully absorbed what happened, the ROTHS Shield banking house is said to already know. The precise details of this story have been repeated so often, and with such varying embellishment, that historians studying the Shield family caution against treating every version as reliable. What is well documented, independent of the most dramatic tellings, is that the family had built one of the fastest private courier and information networks in Europe well before 1815, using it to move both money and news between capital cities faster than most competitors and often faster than governments themselves. This network gave the family a habit of acting on information before it became general public knowledge, a genuine and significant advantage in an era when news travelled only as fast as a horse or a ship could carry it. The family had positioned agents and couriers across major European cities specifically to keep information flowing quickly back to their banking operations, treating the speed of a piece of news as valuable in its own right, separate from the news content. Whether the specific Waterloo trade described in popular legend happened exactly as often told, with Nathan ROTHS Shield supposedly selling bonds to create a false impression of defeat before buying heavily once the true victory was confirmed, remains contested among historians, some of whom argue the story emerged later as a simplified, dramatic explanation for wealth the family had actually built more gradually through this broader information advantage. What the legend does capture accurately, even if its specific details are exaggerated, is the underlying habit. The Rothschilds treated fast, reliable information as an asset worth building infrastructure around, decades before telegraphs or later technology made rapid information sharing available to everyone. The courier network eventually became obsolete as faster communication reached everyone equally. The habit of valuing information speed above almost everything else did not. Thomas Lipton grew up working in his parents' small grocery shop in Glasgow, before eventually building one of the largest tea businesses in the world, and the habit that set his company apart from the beginning was a relentless focus on cutting prices that competitors considered impossible to sustain. Rather than treating tea as an expensive luxury sold in small quantities through specialty merchants, as most of the trade did at the time, Lipton bought tea estates directly in Ceylon, cutting out the layers of brokers and middlemen that typically stood between a plantation and a British household's teapot. This let him sell tea at prices ordinary working families could afford regularly, rather than only on special occasions, and he advertised the low prices aggressively, using bold, direct marketing that stood out sharply against the more reserved advertising style most of his competitors preferred. Lipton expanded his own retail shops rapidly across Britain, to control as much of the chain from plantation to customer as he reasonably could, reducing his dependence on any single supplier or distributor along the way. He was known for personally visiting his tea estates and inspecting operations directly, insisting that quality control mattered as much as low price, since a cheap product that tasted poor would undercut the entire strategy his company depended on. This combination, controlling supply directly while pricing aggressively for volume rather than margin, let Lipton's company grow at a pace that surprised competitors who had assumed tea would remain a slow-growing specialty trade indefinitely. By the time of his death, Lipton had built a company whose name remained recognizable on tea shelves worldwide for generations afterward, built less on any single clever trick than on a sustained habit of controlling costs at every step between the plantation and the cup. The specialty tea merchants he undercut mostly faded from public memory. His name stayed on the shelf. Henry Ford spent considerable time on the actual floor of his Highland Park factory, watching workers install parts, timing how long each task took, and adjusting the layout of machines and workstations based directly on what he observed, rather than relying entirely on reports passed up through layers of management. This habit of close, physical observation fed directly into the development of the moving assembly line, which broke automobile production into small, repeated tasks performed by workers stationed along a continuously moving line, rather than workers moving between stationary cars. Ford and his engineers refined the line's speed and layout through repeated, direct adjustment on the factory floor itself, watching where workers fell behind or stood idle, and reshaping the physical arrangement of the plant accordingly, often making changes within days based on what a single shift's observation had revealed. The habit extended into Ford's approach to wages as well. In 1914, he raised wages significantly for many of his factory workers, a decision he explained partly in terms of reducing the high turnover that had been disrupting the assembly line's efficiency, since constantly training new workers slowed the very process he had spent so much time perfecting on the floor. Colleagues described Ford as someone who trusted what he could observe directly over what he was told secondhand, a preference that occasionally put him at odds with managers who felt undermined by his habit of appearing unannounced to check details himself. This close attention to the physical process of manufacturing, sustained over years rather than treated as a one-time efficiency project, let Ford's company reduce the time needed to build a single car dramatically, which in turn let the company lower prices and expand its customer base far beyond the wealthy buyers who had been the automobile's original market. The assembly line eventually spread to industries far beyond automobiles. The habit of watching it closely, in person, stayed distinctly Ford's own for as long as he ran the company. John Jacob Astor arrived in the United States from Germany with little money and built his first fortune trading furs across the American frontier, a business that required patience of its own kind, waiting months for trapping seasons and trade routes to produce results. But the habit that eventually made him the wealthiest man in the country involved a different, longer kind of patience entirely. Astor began using his fur trade profits to buy land in and around Manhattan while the city was still comparatively small, often purchasing plots at the edges of settled areas that most contemporaries considered too far from the city's center to be valuable. Rather than developing or reselling this land quickly, Astor largely held on to it, sometimes for decades, as New York's population and boundaries expanded out years or even decades to even decades earlier, at a fraction of its later value. This habit of buying and simply waiting, without needing to actively manage or develop the land in the meantime, distinguished Astor from many contemporaries who treated real estate as something to be improved and flipped for a faster profit. Astor understood, correctly as it turned out, that a growing city's expansion would do most of the work of increasing his land's value without requiring him to build anything on it himself. He was famously reluctant to sell property, even when offered prices that seemed generous at the time, reasoning that the city's continued growth would make the same land worth considerably more if he simply held on longer. By the time of his death, Astor's land holdings across Manhattan had made him by most estimates the wealthiest person in the United States, built less on any single transaction than on a habit of patient accumulation across a city that kept growing exactly as he had wagered it would. The frontier furs that started his fortune eventually stopped mattering. The land he quietly held on to never stopped growing in value around him. Henry Hines began his food business, selling horseradish in clear glass bottles rather than the colored glass most competitors used. A small decision meant to let customers see exactly what they were buying. Since Hines believed transparency about the product's actual appearance would build trust that colored glass, sometimes used to hide inferior ingredients, could not. This early instinct grew into a broader company habit of insisting on consistent, verifiable quality across every product Hines sold. At a time when food adulteration, the practice of quietly stretching or disguising ingredients with cheaper substitutes, was widespread and largely unregulated in American manufacturing, Hines voluntarily adopted purity standards, well before federal food safety laws required anything similar, advertising the cleanliness of his factories and the consistency of his recipes as a central selling point, rather than a hidden operational detail. Hines insisted that a can or jar bearing his company's name taste essentially identical whether a customer bought it that week or the next year, a standard that required careful, repeated testing of ingredients and recipes across every batch produced. He opened his factories to public tours specifically to demonstrate this consistency, letting ordinary visitors watch the production process directly rather than simply taking the company's word for its cleanliness and quality. This habit of visible, verifiable consistency helped Heinz Company build a level of consumer trust that many food companies of the era, operating with far less transparency, struggled to match. The famous slogan referencing 57 varieties, chosen for its appealing sound rather than strict accuracy about the company's actual product count, became shorthand for a broader promise that had been built through years of consistent, testable practice rather than advertising alone. Consumers could not see inside every factory personally. Heinz built his fortune convincing them they did not need to. Anita Roddick mixed her earliest cosmetic products in her own kitchen, working from natural ingredients like cocoa butter and aloe vera rather than the synthetic compounds common in mainstream cosmetics manufacturing at the time, testing the results on herself and her family before ever considering selling them commercially. She opened her first small shop in Brighton in 1976 largely out of financial necessity, while her husband was travelling. And from the beginning she filled the store's shelves with small, refillable containers rather than heavily packaged products, partly to save money on packaging, and partly because she genuinely disliked waste. Roddick sourced many of her ingredients through direct relationships with small producers and communities around the world, a practice that predated the broader industry's later interest in what came to be called ethical or fair trade sourcing by years. This habit of hands-on, ingredient-focused development continued even as the Body Shop grew from a single shop into an international chain. Roddick remained personally involved in identifying new natural ingredients, travelling to meet suppliers directly, rather than relying entirely on procurement staff to manage those relationships, and she used the company shops themselves as a platform for causes she cared about, printing information about environmental and social issues directly onto product packaging, at a time when most cosmetics companies avoided any such statements as commercially risky. Roddick's insistence on natural ingredients and direct supplier relationships shaped an industry that eventually followed her lead broadly, though she herself often expressed frustration in later interviews that larger competitors adopted the language of natural and ethical sourcing more easily than the substance of it. The habit that began in her own kitchen, testing and refining formulations by hand before ever manufacturing them at scale, remained closely associated with the brand for as long as she led it personally. The kitchen experiments eventually became a company with thousands of stores. The insistence on knowing exactly where every ingredient came from never entirely left it. In the early 1930s, with global trade collapsing under the weight of the Depression, shipping companies around the world were laying up vessels they could no longer profitably operate, and several were selling ships outright at prices far below what they had cost to build only a few years earlier. Totel Onassis, a young Greek businessman who had already built some wealth through tobacco trading, used the moment to buy several Canadian cargo ships at what later accounts describe as a small fraction of their original construction cost, at a time when most established shipping families considered new purchases far too risky given how depressed freight rates had become. He continued expanding his fleet through the remainder of the decade, buying additional vessels as prices stayed low and competitors remained cautious about committing further capital to an industry that showed few signs of recovering quickly. This willingness to buy heavily discounted assets during a period of widespread caution, rather than waiting for clearer signs of recovery before committing money, became a recurring pattern across Onassis' career, repeated later with tanker purchases after other periods of industry contraction. He reasoned, according to biographers who studied his early decisions, that shipping demand would eventually recover as global trade resumed, and that vessels bought cheaply during the depths of a downturn would be worth considerably more once that recovery arrived, a bet that required him to hold his nerve through years where the broader industry offered little reassurance that he was right. By the time global shipping demand did recover, particularly during and after the Second World War, Onassis' fleet, built substantially from these Depression-era purchases, positioned him to become one of the wealthiest ship owners in the world, a position built less on any single dramatic deal than on a sustained willingness to buy when almost everyone else in his industry had stopped. The ships bought cheaply in the 1930s eventually carried cargo across a world that had by then entirely forgotten how little they had once cost. Azim Premji inherited a small vegetable oil manufacturing business from his father as a young man after returning from his university studies, and over the following decades he transformed it into Wipro, one of India's largest information technology companies, all while maintaining personal habits that seemed almost deliberately unremarkable for a man of his eventual wealth. Premji was known for flying economy class on business trips, well after private travel would have been an easy expense for him to justify, and colleagues described a modest personal car and a general reluctance toward visible displays of wealth that stood in contrast to some of his contemporaries among India's wealthiest business leaders. He reportedly monitored small operational costs within Wipro personally in the company's earlier years, questioning expenses that seemed unnecessary with the same directness he applied to his own spending. This habit extended into how Premji structured his philanthropy as well. He transferred an enormous portion of his personal shareholding in Wipro into a charitable foundation focused on education in India, a decision that, measured as a share of his total wealth given away, ranks among the largest charitable transfers by any individual globally. Colleagues and journalists who covered his career consistently noted the contrast between the scale of his giving and the plainness of his daily habits, a combination that seemed, in interviews, entirely genuine rather than performed for public effect. Premji stepped back from Wipro's daily leadership after decades running the company, having built it from a small regional business into a firm employing hundreds of thousands of people across the technology sector. Throughout that growth, his personal habits changed remarkably little, a consistency biographers have attributed to a value system formed early, well before the wealth that later tested it had actually arrived. The vegetable oil business he inherited barely resembles the company Wipro eventually became. The frugal habits he brought to it somehow did not need to change to keep up. R. Child began as a coin dealer and moneylender in Frankfurt, and rather than building a single banking house in one city and hoping his sons would eventually take it over together, he made a deliberate choice to send them out separately, establishing banking houses in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, one son to each city. This structure gave the family a coordination advantage that few competing banking families of the era could match. Because the brothers operated in 5 major financial and political centres simultaneously, information about currency movements, government borrowing needs, and political developments could reach the family network from multiple directions at once, then be compared and acted on collectively, rather than relying on a single city's perspective. Letters between the brothers, many of which survive in family and institutional archives, show a business run through constant, detailed coordination across enormous geographic distances, an unusually sophisticated arrangement for the communication technology available at the time. Arrow Tate-Child's decision to keep the business within the family rather than bringing in outside partners also meant that trust between the 5 branches did not need to be built from scratch, since it already existed through family ties, at a time when trust between separate banking houses in different cities could otherwise take years to establish. The brothers intermarried extensively with cousins from within the extended family in subsequent generations, a practice that some biographers have read as an additional habit meant to keep control and information concentrated within a small trusted circle rather than dispersed to outside in-laws. This deliberate structure of family dispersion across major cities, paired with tight internal coordination, let the Arrow Tate-Child banking network respond to major European events, wars, currency crises, government financing needs, with a speed and coordinated scale that few rivals in any single city could match on their own. 5 cities, 1 family, and 1 habit of trusting almost no one outside it quite as much. James Cash Penney's name, by pure coincidence of birth rather than any deliberate branding, matched almost exactly the habit that defined how he ran his stores for decades, a close, sometimes obsessive attention to every small cost and every cent of profit margin across an expanding chain of dry goods stores. Penney started as a clerk in a small store in Wyoming before eventually buying into and then expanding a chain that grew into thousands of locations across the country. He insisted on a strict pricing policy that avoided the haggling and inconsistent markups common in retail at the time, instead posting fixed honest prices that customers would be the same regardless of who they negotiated with, a policy he framed explicitly in moral terms tied to his religious upbringing rather than purely as a business strategy. He tracked expenses across his growing chain of stores with a level of personal attention that surprised employees managing far smaller operations, reviewing store-level financial reports himself well after the company had grown large enough that most owners would have delegated the task entirely. Colleagues described him as treating a wasted cent in a single store's operating budget, with roughly the same seriousness he applied to decisions about opening entirely new locations, a habit that some found excessive but which Penney maintained was inseparable from the honest, consistent pricing policy the company had built its reputation on. Penney lost the majority of his personal fortune during the Great Depression after guaranteeing loans for employees and the company itself, and reportedly worked well into old age afterward, partly to rebuild what had been lost, never abandoning the habit of close personal attention to costs, even after rebuilding a considerable portion of his wealth. The chain that carried his name outlived both his fortune's collapse and its recovery. The habit that gave him his fortune in the first place never really left him. Joseph Kennedy liked to tell a story, repeated by his family, and by journalists for decades afterward, about a shoeshine boy who offered him a hot stock tip sometime in 1929, prompting Kennedy to conclude that if shoeshine boys were confidently trading stocks, the market had gotten dangerously far ahead of itself. Kennedy sold much of his stock holdings shortly afterward, before the crash that autumn wiped out a large share of his contemporaries' fortunes. Historians studying the story have generally treated it as likely embellished in the retelling, a colourful shorthand for a broader and more defensible pattern in Kennedy's actual investment behaviour rather than a single, literal, decisive encounter. What is better documented is that Kennedy paid close attention to how widely and casually stock speculation had spread among people with no particular financial expertise, treating that spread itself as a signal worth acting on rather than simply enjoying the enthusiasm while it lasted. This habit, watching for the moment ordinary, inexperienced participation in a speculative market, becomes nearly universal, rather than staying confined to specialists, appears in various forms across the biographies of several people who avoided the worst of the 1929 crash. Kennedy's own account emphasized the specific texture of the shoeshine boy encounter, because it captured something concrete about how far speculation had spread beyond anyone with real expertise to judge the risk, even if the anecdote's exact details softened or sharpened with each retelling over the following decades. Kennedy went on to serve in senior government roles, including as the first head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, an appointment some contemporaries found ironic given his own earlier stock market dealings, though he was chosen partly because his experience made him unusually familiar with exactly the kinds of speculative excess the new commission was meant to police. The shoeshine boy, if he existed as told, never knew what his passing comment was later credited with saving. The habit the story stood for outlived the story's own uncertain details by a wide margin. Rig Lee began his business selling soap and baking powder, and to encourage retailers to stock his products, he began including free gifts with larger orders, eventually including free packs of chewing gum as an incentive. When the gum proved more popular with customers than the soap itself, Wrigley made an unusual decision, shifting his entire business toward chewing gum and using the same instinct for generous giveaways to build the new products market from nearly nothing. Wrigley mailed free sticks of gum to residents across entire cities, and later, in one of the more dramatic examples, to nearly every listed telephone number in the United States, a giveaway conducted at considerable upfront cost, with no guarantee that recipients would ever become paying customers. He reasoned that once people tried the product and liked it, the habit of chewing gum regularly, once formed, would generate steady repeat purchases far exceeding the cost of the initial giveaway. This habit of treating free distribution as an investment in building a repeated habit, rather than simply hoping advertising alone, would convince people to try something new, ran through Wrigley's marketing for decades. He advertised aggressively during economic downturns when many competitors cut spending, reasoning that maintaining visibility while others retreated would leave his brand more strongly positioned once conditions improved, a version of the same underlying logic behind the giveaways themselves. Spend now to secure a habit that pays back steadily later. By the time Wrigley's company had grown into the largest chewing gum manufacturer in the world, the free sample habit that had once seemed reckless when applied at national scale had become one of the more studied examples in the history of American marketing, cited by later businesses building the center it afterward around giving a product away to create demand for it. Afterward, the soap and baking powder that started the company faded from its shelves entirely. The habit of giving the product away first never really did. Alfred Nobel opened a newspaper one morning to find his own obituary printed inside, the result of a French journalist confusing his death with that of his brother Ludwig, who had actually died. The obituary described Nobel bluntly as a merchant of death, a reference to his fortune built substantially on the invention and manufacture of dynamite and other explosives. Nobel was reportedly disturbed enough by the description, false though the underlying death had been, that biographers studying his later life consistently point to the episode as a turning point in how he thought about his own legacy. Rather than dismissing the obituary as simply a journalist's error, Nobel appears to have taken the harsh characterization seriously as a preview of how history might actually remember him if he did nothing to shape that memory himself. In the years that followed, Nobel drafted a will that redirected the majority of his considerable fortune, built through more than 300 patents across chemistry and engineering, into a set of prizes to be awarded annually in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace, funded by an endowment structured to keep generating prize money indefinitely rather than being spent down. The decision surprised his family, some of whom contested the will, since it left them a smaller inheritance than they had expected in favour of an institution designed to outlast Nobel's own lifetime by an enormous margin. Nobel did not live to see the first prizes awarded, dying the year after finalising the will, but the institution he created eventually became so closely associated with achievement and recognition that his earlier reputation as a merchant of death, the very description that had apparently unsettled him, largely faded from how most people came to know his name. The mistaken Obituary got the date of his death wrong by years. It may have gotten his actual legacy more right than anyone, including Nobel himself, expected at the time. Jaswayawi Jaywood kept a private notebook recording the details of thousands of pottery firing experiments, tracking kiln temperatures, clay mixtures, and glaze formulas with a precision unusual for a manufacturing trade that had, for generations before him, relied largely on inherited craft knowledge passed down informally between potters. Wedgwood approached his ceramics business with an experimental discipline closer to the emerging scientific methods of his era than to traditional craft practice, testing variations in materials methodically and recording which combinations produced reliable results and which produced flawed or inconsistent pieces. He developed a device called a pyrometer to measure kiln temperatures more precisely than earlier potters had been able to, addressing a long-standing problem where firing temperature, difficult to judge by eye alone, had caused unpredictable variation in finished pottery from batch to batch. This habit of documenting failures alongside successes let Wedgwood identify reliable formulas for his creamware and later jasperware lines, achieving a level of consistency across large production, runs that competitors relying on individual potters' informal judgment struggled to match at scale. He extended the same disciplined approach into quality control on the factory floor, reportedly smashing pieces that did not meet his standard, rather than allowing imperfect work to reach customers, a habit that reinforced among his workers exactly how seriously he took the consistency his notebook experiments had painstakingly established. Wedgwood combined this manufacturing discipline with equally deliberate marketing, securing royal patronage for his ceramics and using the association to build demand among wealthy customers, then using improving production efficiency to gradually extend similar quality to a broader, less wealthy market as well. The company he built continued producing ceramics using principles descended from his original experimental notebooks for generations after his death. The notebook itself recorded nothing more exciting than temperatures and material ratios, page after page. The pottery built on top of it eventually reached tables across the world. When a group of anxious bankers asked J.P. Morgan during the panic of 1907 what would happen if a particular struggling trust company failed, contemporaries recorded that Morgan offered little explanation of his private reasoning before simply directing the room toward a coordinated rescue plan he had already largely worked out in his head. Morgan was widely known among his contemporaries for extending or withholding enormous loans based significantly on his personal judgment of a borrower's character, a factor he weighed alongside financial statements rather than treating documentation as sufficient on its own. He testified before a congressional committee investigating banking practices that character mattered to him more than either property or money when deciding whether to extend credit, a statement that struck some observers as old-fashioned even at the time, though it reflected genuinely how he appears to have operated across decades of major lending decisions. This habit of judging trust personally, combined with a general reluctance to explain his private reasoning to outsiders, gave Morgan enormous influence during several financial crises, including the Panic of 1907, when the United States had no central bank, and Morgan personally organized a coalition of banks to provide emergency liquidity and prevent a wider collapse, essentially performing a function that a central bank would later be created specifically to handle. He made these decisions quickly and largely without public explanation, trusting his own read of which institutions were fundamentally sound and which were not. Morgan's willingness to act decisively and privately, rather than through visible public deliberation, made him both indispensable during crises and to critics, uncomfortably powerful for a private individual to hold that much unaccountable influence over the financial system. The panic passed. The habit of deciding quickly and explaining rarely stayed closely associated with his name long after. Congress eventually created the Federal Reserve, partly in response to concerns about relying on one banker's private judgment. Morgan himself never fully explained why his judgment had worked as well as it apparently had. William Wallace Cargill founded a small grain storage business in Iowa shortly after the American Civil War, and more than a century and a half later, the company that grew from it remains privately owned by his descendants and the related Macmillan family, never having sold shares to the public despite growing into one of the largest agricultural trading companies in the world. This habit of remaining private, sustained across generations at a scale where almost every comparable competitor in global commodities trading eventually did go public, reflects a deliberate, repeatedly reaffirmed family decision rather than an accident of circumstance. Cargill's leadership across successive generations has generally described the choice as protecting the company's ability to make long-term decisions, particularly around commodity trading positions that can look risky or volatile within any single financial quarter, without needing to satisfy public shareholders demanding steady, predictable short-term results. Staying private has also let the company keep an unusual degree of information about its own operations away from public disclosure, a competitive advantage in an industry where knowing more than rivals about global supply, weather patterns, and shipping capacity can translate directly into trading profit. Journalists and researchers studying the company have consistently noted how much less is publicly known about Cargill's internal finances and strategy compared to publicly traded competitors of similar size, a direct consequence of the family's sustained habit of resisting the disclosure requirements that come with a public stock listing. The company has, over generations, built one of the largest private fortunes in the world spread across a large extended family, with family members holding shares that rarely trade outside the family itself, maintained through careful succession planning across multiple generations rather than any single dramatic business decision. Public companies in the same industry eventually had to answer to shareholders every quarter. Cargill, by sustained family habit, mostly never has. P.T. Barnum had already built one fortune through museums and travelling exhibitions when a business partnership involving a clock manufacturing company collapsed in the 1850s, leaving him personally liable for debts that consumed nearly everything he had built, a public and humiliating financial failure that newspapers of the time covered extensively. Rather than treating the collapse as the end of his career, Barnum began rebuilding almost immediately, returning to lecture circuits and museum exhibitions to generate income while working to satisfy his creditors, a process that took years of sustained effort rather than any single dramatic recovery. He wrote and sold an autobiography partly to help repay his debts, treating his own very public failure as material he could still turn into income rather than something to hide from audiences who had read about his troubles in the papers. This habit of using setback itself quite openly as the next chapter of a public story rather than something to conceal appears repeatedly across Barnum's career. He eventually rebuilt his fortune substantially through new ventures, including a later partnership, creating the circus that would carry his name into the 20th century, decades after the clock company collapse had seemed, to observers at the time, like a career-ending disaster. Barnum was famously willing to acknowledge his own failures publicly in ways many contemporaries in business considered reckless, reasoning that audiences forgave a showman who admitted his mistakes more readily than one who tried to hide them. This same willingness to be publicly associated with both spectacular success and spectacular failure, without treating either as a permanent identity, let him keep building new ventures well into his later years, long after the clock company debts had been fully repaid, and mostly forgotten by everyone except Barnum himself, who referenced the episode in his own writing for the rest of his life. The clock company itself disappeared entirely from public memory. The man it nearly ruined did not. Before Cosimo de' Medici became the quiet power behind Florence, his father, Giove, Nidi Bici de' Medici, built the family's banking fortune with a habit that history has generally treated as less dramatic, but in its own way just as consequential, a persistent reluctance to overextend the bank's lending regardless of how tempting a larger opportunity looked. Several larger, and for a time, more prominent Florentine banking houses of the same period pursued aggressive lending to foreign monarchs, particularly the English crown, whose eventual default on enormous debts helped collapse at least two of the era's largest banking families. Giovanni appears to have watched this pattern with real caution, keeping the Medici banks lending more conservative and diversified across smaller merchant and trade financing, rather than concentrating enormous sums in loans to any single powerful and potentially unreliable borrower. This habit of deliberate restraint meant the early Medici Bank grew more slowly than some of its flashier rivals during Giovanni's lifetime, a trade-off he appears to have accepted consciously. Florentine records from the period suggest Giovanni advised his sons directly to avoid the kind of concentrated risk that had ruined competitors, guidance that Cosimo largely followed, even as he expanded the bank considerably beyond what his father had built, extending its reach into papal banking and international trade financing across a wider network of cities. Historians studying the Medici Bank's long-term survival in an era when many comparably sized banking houses collapsed within a generation or two have pointed to this early caution as a meaningful part of the explanation, alongside the more famous political skill Cosimo and later Lorenzo brought to the family's later larger fortune. The caution never made for as dramatic a story as the family's later political dominance. It simply meant there was still a bank left for that later dominance to be built on. Frank Winfield Woolworth opened his first successful 5 and 10-cent store after an earlier attempt had failed, and the pricing structure itself, nothing sold above 10 cents, became the defining habit of the entire retail chain that grew from it, eventually spreading to thousands of locations across the country. Woolworth maintained this strict ceiling with real discipline, negotiating aggressively with suppliers and manufacturers specifically to find products that could be profitably sold within the fixed price limit rather than simply raising prices when costs rose the way most retailers would. This required him to constantly search for new suppliers willing to manufacture goods to a price point rather than a quality standard alone, and it shaped the entire company's purchasing strategy around a single, unbending number that customers could trust completely, walking into any Woolworth store in any city, and knowing exactly what the most expensive item on the shelf would cost them. The habit worked remarkably well for decades, building customer trust and rapid, disciplined growth across a retail landscape where pricing elsewhere could vary unpredictably. It also created a long-term strain that eventually forced the company to abandon the fixed ceiling entirely. Since ordinary inflation over the decades that followed Woolworth's death made a strict 10-cent maximum increasingly impossible to sustain without steadily degrading the quality of goods sold under it. Woolworth himself did not live to see the ceiling finally abandoned, having built the habit as discipline into the company's identity so thoroughly that changing it after his death required a genuine, difficult break from decades of established practice. The fixed price had been the company's greatest strength for most of his lifetime, and became eventually one of its hardest habits to finally let go of. The nickel and dime prices did not last forever. The discipline behind enforcing them, for as long as they lasted, built an empire of stores around a single unbending number. As a young telegraph operator working for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Andrew Carnegie was earning a modest clerk's wage when his supervisor, Thomas Scott, offered him the chance to buy 10 shares of stock in the Adams Express Company, a package delivery business, suggesting the young man borrow the money needed to buy in if he did not have it saved. Carnegie did borrow the necessary sum, against the advice some of his own family reportedly offered at the time, and the investment paid dividends that, for a young clerk living on a modest salary, felt substantial almost immediately. He later described receiving his first dividend check as a genuinely formative moment, the first time he had experienced money working independently of the hours he personally spent laboring for wages, an insight that stayed with him as he began looking for further investment opportunities well before he had any significant savings of his own to risk. This habit, acting decisively on a trusted tip from someone he respected even while still a low-paid employee, rather than waiting until he felt comfortably wealthy enough to take the risk, appears repeatedly in accounts of Carnegie's early career. He went on to invest early in oil wells and in the emerging steel industry using capital built partly from these early, comparatively small investments, well before the much larger steel fortune that eventually made him one of the wealthiest men in the world had taken shape. Biographers studying Carnegie's rise have noted that the Adams Express shares themselves were a relatively modest holding in the context of his eventual fortune, but the underlying habit they represent, a willingness to invest borrowed money in an opportunity he trusted, well before he had any real financial cushion to fall back on, mattered considerably more than the specific dividend checks themselves ever did. The 10 shares eventually became a footnote in a much larger career. The willingness to buy them in the first place did not. By the time a large gathering of Vanderbilt descendants met in the middle of the 20th century, Not one of the 100 or so relatives present, according to the family's own later accounts, was a millionaire, a striking fact given that their common ancestor had died with a fortune historians have estimated as among the largest ever accumulated in the United States up to that point. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his fortune through the same close, hands-on attention to shipping and railroads that another item on this list has already described, and he was famously skeptical that his own heirs would manage the money as carefully as he had. His son William inherited and, by most accounts, actually grew the fortune considerably through further railroad consolidation, but the generation after that spread the inheritance across a much larger number of descendants, many of whom built enormous, extravagant houses, particularly the Newport and Fifth Avenue mansions that became famous symbols of Gilded Age excess, spending at a pace the underlying fortune, however large it had once been, could not indefinitely support once divided so many ways. This pattern, an enormous fortune built by one disciplined founder, dispersing rapidly across grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had not personally built it and often had not personally learned the habits that built it, appears across many of history's largest family fortunes, not only the Vanderbilts. Family wealth researchers studying the phenomenon across different eras and countries have generally found some version of the same pattern repeating, a fortune surviving intact through a founder's own lifetime, and often through one further generation of direct involvement, then dispersing considerably faster once it spreads across descendants working from inherited wealth rather than the founder's own habits. Several people described earlier in this list built enormous fortunes through decades of specific, unglamorous, repeated behavior, a ledger kept obsessively, a formula tested personally, a price held to without exception. Almost none of them could pass along the daily discipline itself as easily as they could pass along the money it had produced. The mansions the Vanderbilt heirs built are mostly museums now, open to the public for a ticket price their builders would likely not recognize as remarkable. The habits that built the fortune inside them left the family considerably faster than the money did. Somewhere, in an archive nobody visits often, a slim red notebook from more than a century ago sits closed, its columns still balanced in a boy's careful, upright hand, kept by someone who grew old enough to own oil fields and outlive nearly every rival who once doubted him. He never explained the habit to anyone taking notes. He simply never once stopped keeping it. That is mostly how this list ends too, without a lesson, because none of the people in it were teaching anyone anything at the time. They were only living the way they lived, on ordinary days nobody thought to record, and being written about only afterward, by people trying to make sense of what had actually happened. The widow kept wearing the same black dress, the king kept giving until his own gold was worth less for it. The peddler kept dyeing the same stubborn blue. None of them knew a future would eventually call them self-made, a word that would have described almost none of what they actually experienced while it was happening, which was mostly small choices, repeated for decades, in rooms nobody was filming and nobody, at the time, thought were interesting. If a single thread runs underneath all of it, it may be only this. Fortunes built quickly tend to leave just as quickly, and the ones that stayed were kept by people who treated the keeping itself, not merely the making, as the genuinely interesting part, long after the making had stopped being difficult for them personally. The shoeshine boy from the beginning of this list, real or not quite, presumably went back to shining shoes the next morning, having no idea what his passing comment would later be credited with. Most of the people in this list had no such single lucky or unlucky afternoon to point back to. They simply had a habit, repeated on days no one was watching closely enough to write down, until eventually, decades later, somebody did. The notebook stays closed. Its columns, somewhere, still balance,